They told you the dead can't speak. They lied. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice, whispering from a century and a half ago, the words she wasn't supposed to know. It's February 1849, Massachusetts. The kind of cold that kills a man before he hits the ground. Inside St. Bridget's Church, breath clouds the air like the ghosts of prayers that never got answered. And there she is, Emma Fitzgerald, a 14-year-old Irish immigrant who hasn't spoken a word in 5 years. Everyone believes her silence is a wound from the voyage over, a wound so deep it swallowed her voice whole. Until that morning. The church is mid-sermon. A grieving mother, Mrs. Hutchinson, collapses under the weight of losing her little boy, Thomas. Her cries rip through the stone walls like something alive. The priest moves to comfort her, and then Emma speaks, not just speaks, but speaks as Thomas. She tells his mother about a wooden horse hidden under the floorboards, a gift he never got to give. The mother freezes. That horse is real. She never told a soul. Then comes the song, the private lullaby, the one she made up during storms to help Thomas sleep, words no one else had ever heard. Every face turns to the girl in the back pew. She's pale, green-eyed, her head tilted like she's listening to someone who isn't there, and when she's done, she blinks, confused, as if she just woke up. The town believes they've seen a miracle. But I'm telling you now, miracles don't work like this. This wasn't divine, it wasn't holy. It was a performance, planned years in advance by a family who had been studying, memorizing, cataloging every secret, every sin, every whispered confession of that town since the day they arrived. This was the beginning of a machine built on grief, and once it started turning, it wouldn't stop until it devoured every soul in Millie. Brooke, if you think this is just a ghost story, you're already lost. Because what I'm about to show you isn't about talking to the dead, it's about controlling the living. You have to understand something about Millbrook in 1849. This wasn't Boston, or even a bustling port where rumors and trade kept minds busy. This was an island of cold and hunger surrounded by endless forests. People worked themselves to the bone in the mills, went home to cold rooms, and prayed that sickness didn't take their children before the thaw. In a place like that, grief isn't rare, it's constant. And grief is the most powerful currency in the world. The Fitzgerald family knew this before they ever stepped foot in Massachusetts. Father Cornelius Fitzgerald didn't come with nothing. He came with a plan, an iron-bound trunk, and a family that understood how to make pain pay. His sermons were gentle, his presence reassuring. But behind that voice was a mind like a steel trap. They had been watching the town for 5 years. Cataloguing, recording. In Gaelic script, no Protestant could read. Every whispered secret in the confessional was inked into a ledger no one else would ever see. Which boy kissed which girl behind the tavern? Which man was drowning in debt? Which mother hid an illegitimate child's birth? Emma was the jewel of the plan, the silent child with haunted eyes. Pity is a powerful disguise, and hers was perfect. While people spoke freely around her, assuming she couldn't respond, she absorbed every word. She knew where people hid things. She knew what they feared. And now, on that cold Sunday morning, the trap had sprung. By nightfall, the story of the girl who spoke to the dead was everywhere. People came to the rectory with silver coins, with heirlooms, with anything they thought might open the door to the other side. Emma never refused them. She would sit quietly, tilt her head, and let her eyes glaze over, then deliver words so precise, so intimate, that it shattered even the toughest men. It worked because they wanted it to. They wanted to believe. In a world where life was short and brutal, who wouldn't cling to the idea that love could reach beyond the grave? But here's the truth. No one in Millbrook wanted to face. Every time Emma spoke for the dead, she was tightening a rope. Not around their necks, but around their will. And the Fitzgeralds. They weren't in the business of miracles. They were in the business of ownership. The question was, how far were they willing to go to keep it? The first thing you need to understand about control is this: it's never about force at the start. Force is crude. Force is for amateurs. True control begins with a gift, something so valuable, so life-altering, that you can't imagine giving it up. Emma's gift was precisely that, a lifeline thrown to the drowning. Patrick Fitzgerald, her uncle, worked the taverns and millhouses like a fisherman works the river. He never asked outright about the dead. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, he gathered stories under the guise of friendly talk. How's your Mary holding up? Did your brother ever get that land dispute settled? He was planting hooks, small, harmless, until the day they needed to be pulled. Martha Fitzgerald, Emma's aunt, played the same game in the women's world. Midwife, herbalist, confidant. She'd kneel beside a new mother's bed, pressing a bitter tea to her lips while listening to her speak about the child she lost 3 winters ago. She would remember everything. She never forgot a detail. By the time Emma began speaking to the dead, the family had a library of secrets, each one matched to the name of a grieving soul. And they didn't just use those secrets, they weaponized them. A man would come to Emma for comfort about his brother. She'd mention a private joke only they knew, a piece of family history no one else could possibly guess. His guard would drop instantly. Trust, absolute, unshakable, would bloom in his heart. And when you trust someone with your grief, you'll trust them with anything. Father Fitzgerald understood the deeper power here. Religion had given him the perfect stage, the perfect excuse for the flow of confessions and offerings. But Emma's miracles were different. They were personal, tailor-made. Unlike the mass comfort of a sermon, this was intimacy, and intimacy is addictive. Soon, families weren't just coming for a single message. They were returning, week after week, asking if Emma had heard from their loved ones again. Each return visit meant more information shared, more hooks sunk deeper. You might think of it as a con, but that's too small a word. This wasn't a single trick. This was an architecture, a structure of dependence. By the time the snow began to melt, half the town was in it, whether they realized it or not. And that's when the Fitzgeralds shifted the rules. Because when you own the grief of a man, you don't just own his pain. You own him. At first, the Fitzgeralds kept Emma's work within safe limits, comforting words, assurances of peace, sentimental tokens from the other side. It was enough to hook the community, but not enough to draw suspicion. But power is a hunger, and once you taste it, you start wondering how much more you can take. The first escalation was subtle. A widow came, asking Emma if her husband had forgiven her for something. She didn't say what. Emma paused, as if listening to a voice far away, then answered, "He says you must give Father Fitzgerald the letter hidden in the cedar box, before it falls into the wrong hands." The woman's face drained of color. That letter, a private confession she'd written to herself, never shown to anyone, was in the exact place Emma named. She delivered it to the priest, without hesitation, no questions. That was the test, and it worked. Soon, messages began to carry instructions. He says you should invest in the lumber contract. She says the debt you owe can be forgiven if you speak to Father Fitzgerald in private. They say the church will keep your family safe, if you keep it close. By spring, the line between spiritual guidance and direct influence had vanished. Decisions about business, land, even marriages began flowing through Emma's sessions. People didn't think of it as control, they thought of it as divine counsel, and divine counsel is hard to argue with. It was Father Fitzgerald who perfected the ritual. Families were made to wait in a candlelit room before seeing Emma. The flicker of the flames, the faint smell of incense, the quiet chanting from the chapel next door, all designed to soften the mind, to make it receptive. By the time Emma began speaking, they were already halfway under. And here's where the danger turned absolute. Grief had made them obedient, but now fear sealed the bond. Emma began slipping in warning. Subtle at first. He says to stay away from the riverbank on Tuesday, then more pointed. She says harm will come if you refuse the church's request. No one wanted to test the consequences. In a town where the boundary between superstition and faith was paper-thin, the risk felt real. The Fitzgeralds had moved past sympathy. They were no longer healers of grief. They were architects of fate. And the town of Millbrook didn't realize it yet, but they had already surrendered the most dangerous thing of all, their choice. It started with strangers arriving on horseback. At first, just a few from nearby villages, farmers who had heard whispers about the girl who spoke to the dead. But by late spring, riders were coming from Boston, from Providence, from places whose names Millbrook's children had only heard in passing. They came with stories of shipwrecks, of mining accidents, of children buried far from home. They came with pockets full of coins, gold lockets, and family rings they'd worn for generations. They came ready to believe, and the Fitzgeralds made sure they left in awe. Patrick began making trips himself, slipping into taverns in other towns, letting the miracle story accidentally pass his lips in conversation. "It's strange," he'd say, "how she knows things no one should. It was bait, and grief will follow bait faster than hunger ever will." Martha, meanwhile, turned her herbal remedies into a delivery service. She'd travel to neighboring towns under the guise of selling her teas and tinctures, listening, noting names, details, losses. Every interaction was a seed planted. Weeks later, those same people would appear at St. Bridget's door, certain they had come by their decision on their own. But here's the genius, and the danger. The Fitzgeralds didn't just take money, they took information. Outsiders often spoke more freely than locals, not realizing they were giving the family tools to use against them later. A merchant might admit to smuggling goods to avoid taxes. A young woman might confide in Martha about a lover she wasn't supposed to have. These confessions were filed away, just as the locals had been. Emma's performances grew more elaborate for these outsiders. She would close her eyes, rock gently, and speak in a tone that seemed to shift. Sometimes warm, sometimes sharp, always precise. If the visitor was wealthy, she might receive a request for, or a generous donation to the church's upkeep. If they had influence, she might plant a thought about supporting Father Fitzgerald's efforts to protect the faith from Protestant persecution. And they gave. God, how they gave. Within months, the church's coffers were fuller than they'd ever been. Repairs were made, new vestments arrived, the candles never ran out. But every outsider who came also left something else behind. Weight. The weight of their belief, their story, their secret. And the more people believed, the harder it became for anyone to question the truth. In Millbrook, doubt itself began to feel dangerous. Because when enough people kneel before the same altar, standing up feels like treason. The first crack came from someone who should have been untouchable. His name was Dr. Thomas Avery, a tall, spare man with cold, deliberate hands and an accent that carried the clipped precision of Harvard. He had come to Millbrook years before, not for faith, but for peace and quiet. He treated sickness with logic and science, and he had little patience for talk of visions or spirits. When the Fitzgeralds began their rise, Avery kept his distance. But then one of his patients, an elderly widower named Samuel Pike, came to him in a state of collapse. Not from illness, but from fear. Pike claimed Emma had given him a warning, that if he refused to sell his land to a certain friend of the church, his late wife's spirit would turn away from him forever. Pike was a stubborn man, but grief had a way of softening even the hardest will. Still, he couldn't bring himself to part with the land. 2 weeks later, his barn burned to the ground. The town whispered of lightning, but there had been no storm. Pike swore someone had done it, but no one would listen. The Fitzgerald sent Emma to his bedside, speaking soothingly about testing the faith and the trials the dead must watch us endure. Pike, half mad with loss and ruin, finally agreed to sell. Avery saw it all. The manipulation, the timing, the way Pike's surrender brought visible relief to Father Fitzgerald's face, and something in him hardened. He began watching more closely, listening. He noticed how Emma's predictions often aligned with the church's needs, how those who resisted advice often suffered sudden misfortunes, a mysteriously sick cow, a collapsed roof, a deal gone sour. But suspicion was one thing, proof was another, and in Millbrook, proof against the Fitzgeralds was a dangerous thing to seek. Still, Avery was not a man to let rot go unchecked. Quietly, he began keeping a ledger, dates, names, events, coincidences too sharp to ignore. He wrote in a code only he could read, and hid it behind false books in his study. What he didn't know was that the Fitzgeralds already suspected him. And in a game where information was power, Avery had just painted a target on his own back. Because in Millbrook you could doubt the weather, you could doubt the harvest, but to doubt the girl who spoke to the dead was to risk becoming one of the voices she claimed to hear. The Fitzgeralds never moved openly against a threat. That was their genius. They preferred a slow tightening, the kind you didn't feel until you couldn't breathe. At first, it was small things. Parishioners who had once greeted Dr. Avery in the street began to avert their eyes. Long-time patients suddenly claimed they were feeling better and no longer needed his services. Mothers crossed to the other side of the road when walking with their children. It wasn't random. Patrick Fitzgerald began weaving Avery into his sermons, not by name, but with parables about the learned man who places books before God and the physician who cures the body but poisons the soul. Every listener knew who he meant. Martha played her part too. When visiting homes, she would sigh heavily and speak of those who cannot accept the gifts heaven sends, planting seeds of distrust. In a town where most news traveled by whispered repetition, it only took a few days for the doctor's reputation to begin rotting. Emma was the scalpel. During one of her public readings in the church, she fell silent mid-vision. Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "There is someone here who carries the smell of the grave but pretends to bring life." No name, no accusation, but every head turned toward Avery. From that day, he noticed the change in how people looked at him. Not just suspicion, but fear, as if speaking to him might invite some unseen curse. Then came the practical attacks. One night his stable door was left open, and his horse, his only means of reaching distant patients, was found lame by morning. A month later, a shipment of medicine from Boston mysteriously vanished before reaching his hands. The town constable, a devout member of St. Bridges, declared it likely a misdelivery and took no further action. By summer's end, Avery could see the trap closing. His income had halved, his social ties were fraying, and those who still trusted him did so quietly, behind closed doors. But the doctor was not without weapons of his own. The ledger hidden behind his books was growing heavier by the week, each entry a knife waiting for the right moment to be drawn. He knew the Fitzgeralds were watching him. What they didn't know, at least not yet, was that he was watching them back. Dr. Avery understood one thing about liars. The good ones never tripped over their own tongues. If Emma Fitzgerald was a fraud, it would not be in what she said, but in how she said it when the script ran out. He needed to corner her, privately, without the family's protective wall. The opportunity came on a wet Thursday afternoon when Emma, carrying a covered basket, stopped by the small apothecary across from Avery's office. The Fitzgeralds were expecting her home before evening mass. Patrick was away on parish business, and Martha was visiting a bedridden parishioner. For perhaps the first time in months, Emma was alone. Avery crossed the street with deliberate calm and greeted her as though nothing in the world were amiss. "Miss Fitzgerald," he said lightly, "a moment of your time. A matter of the heart." The phrase was bait. In Millbrook, matters of the heart often meant whispers from the dead. Emma hesitated, then nodded, allowing him to lead her into his office. Once the door was closed, Avery produced a locket from his desk drawer. Inside was a daguerreotype of a young woman, pale, smiling faintly, hair tied in a ribbon. The woman had never lived. Avery had commissioned the photograph from a Boston artist, a complete fiction. "I need to know," Avery said, voice measured, "if she forgives me." Emma's gaze flicked to the picture, then back to Avery. For the briefest instant, her lips tightened, not in grief, but in calculation. She began to speak, slow and soft, words dripping with manufactured sorrow. She says, "She has been watching you from the field of stars, and she knows the burden you carry." Avery leaned forward, eyes hard. "Tell me her name." The pause was too long. Emma swallowed. "Margaret. Margaret Avery." The doctor smiled thinly. "Interesting. Because she never existed." For a heartbeat, Emma's mask faltered. Her fingers tightened on the basket handle. Then, without a word, she stood and left the room, the door shutting with a muted finality. That evening, as Avery returned home, he found a scrap of paper slipped under his door. The handwriting was looping, elegant, unmistakably Martha's. It read, "Some graves are best left unopened, Doctor." Avery had just made his first open move, and in Millbrook that meant the Fitzgeralds would make theirs. The change came quickly. If the Fitzgeralds' earlier campaign against Avery had been slow poison, this was a knife in the ribs. The very next Sunday, Patrick stood in the pulpit and preached a sermon unlike any he'd given before. His words were fire and brimstone, but the venom underneath was aimed at a single target. "There are among us," he thundered, "those who wear the guise of healers, yet bring death to the soul. Men who mock heaven's gifts, who dare to test the chosen of the Lord as if they were criminals." There was no need to name the doctor. Every set of eyes turned toward him where he sat in the rear pew. Even those who had once defended him looked away. By Monday morning, rumors were multiplying faster than Avery could track them. A child had died after receiving his treatment. A lie, but repeated enough to take root. A widow claimed she'd heard him muttering curses under his breath. A merchant swore he'd seen Avery burying something in the marsh under moonlight. The retaliation wasn't just verbal. 2 of his remaining patients cancelled their appointments, citing concerns from the parish. His firewood delivery for the week never arrived, though he'd paid in advance. That night, a stone shattered his front window. The only sound in the empty street afterward was the faint echo of retreating footsteps. Then there was the note. Pinned to his office door with a rusty nail, it was written in the same elegant hand as before. "You've dug into our garden, Doctor. Be careful what takes root." The implication was clear. This wasn't just about defending Emma's so-called visions. The Fitzgeralds were guarding something larger, something worth crushing a man's life over. Avery knew he could leave, sell the practice, vanish into another town, and rebuild. But something in him refused to bend. Maybe it was professional pride. Maybe it was the gnawing certain soul turns. Tie that the Fitzgeralds' influence was a sickness worse than any he'd ever treated. So he chose the only path left to him: escalation. If the Fitzgeralds wanted a war of whispers, Avery would answer with truths sharp enough to draw blood, and he would start with the one person in their house who might be willing, or desperate enough, to talk. Emma. Avery knew that confronting Emma head-on again would only harden her defenses. If she was a willing conspirator in the Fitzgeralds' little empire of fear, she'd shut him out completely. But if she was trapped, if she was a pawn dressed up as a prophet, there might be a way to reach her. He began by listening, not in his office, but in the spaces between. The bakery queue, the tavern corners, the cold pews before Mass began. Emma, he noticed, had a peculiar habit. She was rarely alone, but never with the same chaperone twice. One day her sister Clara, another day an elderly cousin, sometimes a churchwoman. It was as if the Fitzgeralds rotated watch over her. That pattern meant one thing: they were afraid of who she might speak to. His opportunity came in the most ordinary way: a loose horse. It bolted down Main Street one crisp morning, sending pedestrians scattering. Emma, walking toward the market, stumbled in the chaos. Avery caught her arm before she could fall. The moment was brief, but the surprise had knocked the guard clean off her face. For the first time, she looked like a frightened young woman instead of a saintly vessel. He didn't waste it. "I can help you," he murmured low, under the shouting in the street. If you want out. Emma's eyes darted past him toward her chaperone, Martha this time, who was shoving through the crowd. Her lips trembled just for a second, then she whispered so faint he almost missed it, "They don't let me sleep." And then she was gone, swept back into the Fitzgerald orbit. The message stayed with him like a splinter under the skin. They don't let me sleep. Was it constant prayer, night interrogations, or something far worse? That night, Avery drafted a letter, unsigned, offering Emma a meeting in the abandoned tannery on the edge of town, a place no one visited since the river flooded its lower floor years ago. He slid it into the basket of bread she always carried home from the bakery. He didn't know if she'd come. But if she did, he was finally going to hear her truth without the Fitzgerald's shadow looming over her. The tannery smelled of rot and river mud, a ghost of the industry that had died here a decade earlier. Avery arrived early, pacing the warped floorboards of the upper level, listening to the slow drip of water below. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like it might be watching. He half expected she wouldn't come, half hoped, even, because if she did, it meant they were already in deeper than either of them could crawl out. But then, faint through the hollow air, he heard the quick, light rhythm of someone running. Emma emerged from the dark, hood drawn low, breathless. She shut the door behind her like she was sealing herself away from a predator. "They'll kill me if they know I'm here," she said before he could speak. Her voice wasn't angelic or prophetic now. It was raw, human. Avery motioned her toward a corner, out of sight of the street-facing windows. "I'm not here to hurt you, Emma. I just want to know what they're doing to you." She laughed, not with humor, but with the brittle edge of someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be believed. "They say I see visions. I don't. Not like they tell people. Sometimes I dream things, fragments, but they're not from God." Her eyes darkened. "They're from them." She told him about the nights, how they'd wake her just before dawn, when the body is weakest, led her into the root cellar beneath the parlor, and surround her with candles. The Fitzgerald brothers would chant words she didn't understand, while Patrick placed his hands on her head until her thoughts swam and her tongue moved without her will. "They call it drawing the river," she whispered. "They say the river runs under all of us, and it's older than the church, older than the town. They think I can speak for it." Avery's stomach turned. This wasn't simple superstition. This was deliberate, cultivated transfer. Decay, the kind he'd read about in suppressed anthropological notes. Not for faith, for control. Emma gripped his sleeve suddenly. "They need me for the feast. It's in 3 weeks. That's when the river chooses. You can't let them make me speak for it again." The door slammed below. Heavy boots on wet floorboards. Voices calling Emma's name. Too many to fight, and too close to run. Avery realized with cold certainty. The Fitzgeralds knew. The voices below weren't searching. They were closing in. Avery scanned the tannery's upper floor. No back door, no staircase except the one already echoing with boots. The only exit was the shattered loading window that opened onto the riverbank 20 feet below. Emma followed his eyes and shook her head. "It's too far." "Not for me to decide," Avery cut in. He moved to the window, brushing away jagged glass, gauging the drop. The river was low this season, nothing but mud and rock to break a fall. They'd be bruised, maybe worse, but breathing. The first Fitzgerald enforcer appeared on the stairs, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing the long black coat that Avery had only ever seen on the men who collected the donations for the family's parish. His eyes locked on Emma like she was contraband. "Come now, Miss Emma," he called, voice steady but heavy with warning. "You'll catch a chill in here. Let's get you home." A second man emerged behind him, then a third. The space between them and Avery was shrinking fast. Avery stepped in front of Emma. "You're not taking her?" The lead man's smile was thin, as if Avery's resistance wasn't a threat, just an inconvenience. "The girl's got duties. You wouldn't want to stand in the way of the Lord's work, Reverend." Avery's mind raced. They had numbers and strength. He had seconds and desperation. He grabbed Emma's wrist and pulled her toward the window. The men lunged. The first blow caught Avery's shoulder, spinning him, but he pushed her through the gap before he could be dragged back. She hit the mud below with a cry, but she was moving, trying to scramble up the bank. Avery swung himself halfway out, but a hand like iron gripped the back of his coat. The men hauled him inside, fists hammering ribs, stomach, jaw. His vision flickered. Through the haze he saw Emma looking up from the bank, eyes wide, frozen for a split second. Then she turned and ran, vanishing into the brambles. The last thing Avery heard before the black closed in was the lead man's voice, low and certain. She won't get far. The river always brings her back. When consciousness returned, it did so in pieces. A creak, the sting of split lips, the heavy, damp scent of river reeds. Avery's eyes opened to a dimly lit room. Not a cell, not exactly. The walls were panelled with dark wood, polished and immaculate. The floor beneath him was bare, and his wrists were bound with rough hemp cord, the fibres biting into raw skin. Someone had tended his injuries, crudely, but enough to keep him alive, which meant they didn't plan to kill him. Not yet. The door opened with the softness of someone who never had to knock. A tall man stepped inside. His hair was white, but his shoulders still carried the straightness of authority. His black suit looked older than Avery, yet fit him like it had been stitched to his bones. Patrick Fitzgerald. Even without introduction, Avery knew. There was a gravity to him, the kind that made the air feel heavy, the kind that bent people's will like branches in the wind. "I apologize for the rough welcome," Fitzgerald said, voice deep and calm, as if they were meeting over tea. "But you've shown a troubling interest in matters that are not yours to touch." Avery stayed silent. Words would only give the man more to measure him by. Fitzgerald crossed the room slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "Emma has a gift, a rare one. You've seen enough to know it's true, and yet you tell yourself she's in danger. That's unfortunate." He stopped a few feet away, studying Avery like a craftsman appraising flawed work. "Do you know what's worse than a man who sees evil where there is none? A man who stumbles onto a truth he cannot bear." Avery forced himself to meet Fitzgerald's gaze. "You're not using her for God. You're using her for you." For the first time, something flickered in Fitzgerald's expression. Not anger, but the faintest smile. "And if I am, what is God, Reverend, but the will of those strong enough to speak for him?" He leaned closer, the scent of pipe smoke clinging to him. "Leave. Tonight. Forget the girl. Forget the feast. Forget you ever set foot in this town. If you stay, the river will take you, and unlike Emma, it will not give you back." The door closed behind him, the lock sliding into place. And Avery knew. The threat wasn't bluster. It was a promise. The night was silent when the window latch clicked. A shadow slipped inside. Not Fitzgerald, but a boy no older than 12, narrow-faced, dirt under his fingernails. He didn't speak, only pressed a finger to his lips and gestured for Avery to follow. The cord at Avery's wrists was cut in 2 swift strokes of a rusted knife. Blood rushed back into his hands, bringing pins and needles with it. The boy moved quickly, navigating the hall with the instinct of someone who knew which boards groaned and which doors were never opened. Avery followed, his body aching with every step. The air in the Fitzgerald house smelled of polish and something sweeter, a cloying perfume that felt wrong in a home of men. They reached the servants' entrance at the rear, where the boy pushed open a narrow door. Cold night air rushed in, sharp with the scent of the river. "Why are you helping me?" Avery whispered. The boy finally spoke, voice barely a breath. "Because she helped me once, and they'll take her back. They always do." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness. Avery didn't wait. He slipped into the tree line, keeping low, every muscle taut with the fear of discovery. The Fitzgerald estate loomed behind him, its windows lit like watching eyes. When he reached the town proper, it felt different, emptier. The lamps burned low, the streets quiet. But it wasn't just the hour. There were no signs of Emma, no trace of her anywhere. He checked the tannery. Empty. The boarding house. The room where she had stayed was stripped bare, bed frame leaning against the wall. No bedding, no clothing, no scraps of handwriting. It was as though she had never existed. In the square, the notice board stood under a single oil lamp. Last week's missing persons flyer, the one bearing Emma's face, was gone. In its place was a fresh sheet of parchment. The Feast of St. Bridget. All attend. Beneath it, in neat ink, attendance is worship. Worship is duty. Avery's stomach turned. They hadn't just taken her, they had folded her in. Somewhere she was being prepared. Somewhere she was already theirs. The night before the feast, the town pulsed with a strange, feverish energy. Every window glowed with lamplight, every street hummed with movement. Not the casual chatter of neighbors, but the tight, hushed efficiency of a people working under command. Avery kept to the shadows, slipping between buildings until he reached the northern green, where the preparations were thickest. A platform was being erected there, its frame sturdy, the kind you could hang a man from or display an idol upon. Thick ropes dangled from its crossbeams, swaying in the night breeze. Beneath it, men rolled barrels toward the stage. The stenciled letters on their sides read, "Bridget's Wine." Avery had heard of it in passing, a sacred drink brewed only for this night. He ducked behind a wagon, watching. The townspeople moved in practiced rhythms, like a machine that had been oiled for years. No one laughed. No one stopped to rest. Then he saw her, Emma. She moved at the center of the square, dressed in a plain white gown that glowed faintly in the lamplight. Her hair had been combed straight and tied with a scarlet ribbon. Her expression was not vacant exactly, but hollow. She didn't look left or right. She didn't notice the cold. She didn't seem to notice herself. Two women flanked her, both wearing black veils, guiding her toward the stage. When they spoke to her, she nodded once, mechanically, and resumed walking. Avery's breath caught. The girl he'd known, sharp, defiant, brimming with an odd kind of humor, was gone. This was something shaped, something prepared. From the corner of his eye, movement. Fitzgerald, stepping into view. His presence turned the air heavier. He gave a single nod to the workers, and they moved faster. Avery strained to hear, but Fitzgerald's voice was low, spoken only to the veiled women. Still, 2 words reached him. The offering. It was then Ava saying, I realized. Emma was not just a participant in the feast. She was central to it. If he was going to save her, it would have to be tomorrow, in front of everyone, during the feast itself. And that meant he would have to stand in the open against Fitzgerald, the town, and whatever the Feast of St. Bridget truly was. Morning broke grey and heavy, as if the sky itself knew what the day would bring. By noon, the town square was unrecognizable. The platform stood complete, draped in white cloth stitched with scarlet thread. A wooden arch rose over it, carved with symbols Avery didn't recognize. Spirals, eyes, and shapes that looked uncomfortably like human spines. The townspeople gathered in silence. No murmurs, no idle greetings, no shuffling of feet. Every face was turned toward the stage, their expressions unified in a kind of solemn hunger. At the center of it all stood Fitzgerald, dressed in a black coat with a silver clasp at the throat. His hands rested easily on a walking stick, though Avery doubted he needed it. To his left, the veiled women. To his right, Emma. The white gown she wore yesterday had been replaced with one of deep red, embroidered in gold. Around her neck hung a pendant, an iron key, old and worn smooth. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's. They were fixed on the horizon, as if she'd been told to expect something to come from there. A hush fell deeper still as a bell tolled from somewhere unseen. Fitzgerald stepped forward, his voice carrying easily through the still air. Brothers and sisters, he began, today we honor the covenant. A low, steady murmur answered him. The covenant keeps us. For generations, Fitzgerald continued, we have been spared famine, plague, and the collapse that swallowed other towns whole. We have been preserved because we remember our part. Again the murmur. The covenant keeps us. Avery's stomach tightened. He scanned the crowd, searching for a path to the stage, for any ally who might move when he did. But every set of eyes was fixed on Fitzgerald, as though the man's voice alone bound them in place. Fitzgerald turned to Emma. "The river has been generous," he said, "but it does not give without return." Two men stepped forward, each carrying a clay jar sealed with black wax. They placed them at Emma's feet, and the veiled women began chanting, low at first, then building in volume until the words became indistinct. The crowd answered with a single word that made Avery's blood run cold. Offering. And it was then he understood. This wasn't a play. This wasn't symbolic. The feast was a trade, and Emma was the payment. The chant thickened in the air, heavy enough that Avery felt it pressing on his chest. It wasn't just noise. It was structured, deliberate, almost mathematical in its rhythm. And with each repetition of the word, offering, the crowd leaned forward as if they were drawing some invisible rope tighter around Emma. The veiled women took the clay jars and cracked the black wax seals. A sharp, metallic scent burst into the air, not wine, not incense. Avery knew that smell. Blood. They poured the contents over Emma's feet. The dark liquid spread across the white boards of the platform, dripping through the cracks. She didn't flinch. Fitzgerald lifted his walking stick and tapped it twice against the stage. At that signal, the crowd parted to reveal four men carrying something between them, a long, narrow bundle wrapped in river reeds. As they set it down before Emma, Avery caught sight of a slick, glistening edge protruding from the weave. It was not wood, it was skin. The reeds were peeled away to reveal what looked like the upper half of a man's body, though the skin was stretched thin, the eyes sunken deep into the skull. The color of the flesh was wrong, pale, with a faint green shimmer, as though it had been steeped in water for weeks. "This," Fitzgerald announced, "is what waits in the deep for those who forget their debt." A murmur of fear and reverence rippled through the crowd. The body's mouth opened slightly. Avery froze. It wasn't a corpse. It was alive. The lips moved, releasing a wet, gurgling whisper that sent shivers down his spine. The words were impossible to mistake. "Send her down." Emma's eyes finally moved, locking with Avery's across the square. For an instant, just an instant, he saw her real self flicker through, the girl who had once laughed at him in the schoolyard, but it was smothered almost immediately, replaced by that strand. Hollow calm. Fitzgerald nodded to the carriers. They lifted the man-thing and began walking toward the riverbank at the far edge of the square. The veiled women followed, guiding Emma after them. Avery's pulse roared in his ears. He had minutes, maybe less, before the offering was delivered. He stepped out of the shadows. Avery moved fast, shoving his way through the crowd. Hands tried to stop him, but he ripped free, his boots pounding the dirt as he closed in on the procession. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chant like a gunshot. "Don't move! Don't let them!" He didn't get to finish. Something slammed into his ribs from the side, knocking the wind out of him. A man in a faded militia coat, older but with arms like coiled rope, had tackled him to the ground. Others joined in, gripping his arms and legs with terrifying force. Their faces weren't angry. They were calm, almost sympathetic. "This isn't your place," one of them said quietly, as though comforting a child. "You'll understand soon." Avery thrashed, kicking one man square in the chest. He staggered back, but the others held tight. Avery's boots dug into the dirt, dragging long lines as they hauled him toward the edge of the square. And then he heard it, a sound from the river. It was not the rush of water. It was deeper, thicker, a wet, rolling vibration that seemed to come from far below. It made his teeth ache. The procession reached the bank. The carriers set the half-drowned man down at the water's edge. The veiled women positioned Emma beside him, their chants now so fast and sharp they were almost impossible to follow. The water stirred, not from wind, not from current, from something rising. First came the shadow, darkening the surface. Then, faintly, A row of glistening ridges broke the waterline, too evenly spaced to be natural rock. They shifted, spreading wide, until Avery realized they were not ridges at all. They were teeth, rows of them. The crowd didn't back away. They leaned forward. Some reached toward the water, like worshippers reaching for a blessing. Fitzgerald raised his walking stick high. The thing in the river stopped moving, its teeth still glinting just above the surface. The air was so still Avery could hear Emma's breath. "By this gift," Fitzgerald declared, "we keep the deep at bay." He pushed her forward. Avery tore free of the last man holding him. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He was running straight for the river. Avery didn't think. There was no time for thinking. He hurled himself through the last line of bodies, his boots hitting the damp earth of the riverbank just as Fitzgerald's hand left Emma's shoulder. The water bulged outward as though something beneath it had exhaled. The teeth, those glistening, ridged blades, tilted upward. Avery caught Emma's wrist and yanked with every ounce of strength he had. The crowd reacted instantly. Dozens of hands grabbed at his arms, his coat, his hair. Fingers dug into his flesh, pulling him backward, trying to drag him into the mud, but he wasn't letting go. Then the water erupted. It didn't just break the surface. It exploded, a column of spray and muscle and scale blasting upward. For the briefest instant, Avery saw the thing in full. A head the size of a wagon, plated in ridged bone, eyes like pools of black oil, and a mouth that seemed too wide for nature, filled with rings of wet, yellow teeth. The half-drowned man in reeds didn't scream when it took him. The jaws closed around his upper body, lifting him in one smooth motion, water pouring from between its teeth like rain. The sound, a wet, grinding crack, hit Avery's ears and almost made him vomit. The crowd cheered. A cheer for that. Emma stared at the thing, not in fear, but in the same strange calm as before. Avery pulled again, harder this time, and something shifted in her eyes, the first flicker of panic. That flicker was all it took for the crowd to turn violent. They weren't just restraining him anymore. They were striking him. Fists hammered his ribs, his jaw, his spine. Someone's knee drove into his back. His grip slipped on Emma's wrist. The creature dropped the man's mangled lower half back into the river with a splash, then turned its attention toward the platform. The teeth sank lower, ready for the next offering. Avery's vision blurred. He tried to shout her name again, but blood filled his mouth. His knees hit the mud. He saw Fitzgerald's boots approach, slow and deliberate. "You could have stayed out of this," the old man said. "Now you'll feed it too." The crowd parted, and the river opened. The water roared like something alive. Avery's boots sank into the sucking mud as two men hauled him forward, toward the open mouth that waited at the river's edge. The teeth weren't still now. They shifted, almost impatient, scraping against each other in a wet grind that set his nerves on fire. Emma was gone from his grasp, pulled to the side, shielded by the veiled women. Her eyes darted toward him only once. It was not gratitude. It was not fear. It was something closer to resignation, as though she had always known this moment would come. The crowd's chant built into a frenzy. Fitzgerald raised his stick, signaling the final act. Avery felt the river's breath. Hot, foul, thick with rot and brine. It seemed impossible that this thing had been hiding beneath the same water where children probably played in daylight. The two men shoved him forward, his toes now an inch from the black surface. Then something broke in him. Not fear, fury. With a sudden twist, Avery drove his shoulder into the ribs of the man on his left. He felt bone give under the impact. The other man tried to grab his collar, but Avery snapped his head back, the crack of skull against nose spraying warm blood across his neck. The crowd roared in anger. Fitzgerald shouted for them to hold him. Too late, Avery lunged sideways toward the cluster of veiled women. He grabbed Emma's arm again, ripping her free so violently one of the women fell backward into the mud. Her veil slid off, revealing a face pale and raw as though it had not seen sunlight in decades. The river answered with motion. The creature surged upward, not toward Avery, but toward the cluster of kneeling worshippers, its mouth split impossibly wide. It came down like a collapsing building, swallowing 3 of them whole in a single strike. The chant died in an instant. Chaos ripped through the crowd, screaming, shoving, bodies trampling each other in the scramble to flee. Fitzgerald stood frozen, his stick trembling in his grip. Avery didn't wait to see what would happen next. He pulled Emma into the trees, his boots splashing through the shallows. Behind them, the roar of the river deepened as though the thing beneath had just realized its prey was slipping away. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because if he did, he wasn't sure the sight wouldn't follow him for the rest of his life. They reached the road just as the first pale wash of dawn spread over the treetops. Avery's lungs burned, his legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion. Emma hadn't spoken a word. Not when they fled, not when they stumbled through the mud, not now. He turned to her, ready to demand some explanation, some truth that could make sense of the nightmare on that riverbank. But her eyes were wrong. The resignation he'd seen before was gone. In its place was a faint, almost imperceptible curve of the lips. Not relief, not gratitude, but amusement. "You ran the wrong way," she said quietly. A shiver tore through him. "What?" She stepped past him into the thin morning light. The wind shifted, and for a second, Avery swore he could smell the same stench of rot and brine that had clung to the river's breath. In the distance, through the trees, came a sound that didn't belong in daylight. Not a roar, not a splash, but the slow, deliberate grind of teeth. Emma kept walking. And Avery understood, far too late, that the thing in the river hadn't lost them. It had let them go. For now,